Thank you for joining us for a look at the life of Richard the Lionheart. Before we begin, please remember to subscribe to our channel. Now lie back and join us on this journey through the life of Richard the Lionheart. Richard of Anjou was born on the 8th of September in the year 1157. The city of Oxford lay beneath a low sky of shifting clouds. The stone walls of Beaumont Palace stood firm against the autumn wind. His father was Henry, King of England, who had built a realm that stretched across much of France as well as the island kingdom. His mother was Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and renowned women of her age. From the start, Richard's birth bound him to both England and France, to lands divided by the sea, and to a destiny that would not allow him peace. Richard was the third son, and this gave him both freedom and burden. The eldest son, William, died in infancy. The next, Henry, known as the young king, would one day be crowned during his father's life to secure the dynasty. Richard, younger by 2 years, was not at first the centre of the royal design, but Eleanor had other plans. She adored Aquitaine and wished to see it passed into strong hands. From childhood, Richard was marked out as the heir to his mother's southern duchy, a land of vineyards, troubadours, and restless barons. This was a world far from the grey skies of England. It was a land of sun, stone castles, and songs of knights and lovers. Richard's earliest memories were shaped by this culture, and he grew to reflect it. As a child, Richard was known for his strong frame and fair hair. He had a presence that drew attention. He was quick to learn languages, and soon spoke not only the tongue of the English court, but also the langue obeol of northern France and the langue d'oc of Aquitaine. He grew up surrounded by music, for Eleanor was a patron of poets and musicians who filled her halls with stories of great deeds. The boy listened to tales of Roland and the paladins of Charlemagne, of knights who fought for honour and for God. These tales stirred him deeply. He came to see life as a stage upon which a man might earn eternal fame through courage. This idea would follow him always. But his childhood was not one of idle leisure. Henry, his father, was a stern and restless king, forever moving across his domains to impose his will. He demanded discipline from his sons, and Richard was no exception. Tutors taught him Latin, scripture, and law, but the lessons that mattered most were those of war. From an early age, Richard was taught to ride. He learned to handle a sword, to string a bow, and to sit firm in the saddle with lance in hand. His training was harsh, for knights who lacked skill often did not live long. Richard showed promise, and his strength grew. By his teens he was tall and broad, with the bearing of a warrior. He was also proud. The Plantagenet blood was fierce, and Richard had inherited his mother's will as much as his father's temper. He was not content to be overlooked. When he looked at his elder brother Henry, crowned as junior king, he did not bow with ease. He was loyal to his mother, and Eleanor encouraged him to cherish Aquitaine. She made him duke there in his youth, though his father still held true control. This early taste of power fed his ambition. He was not a boy who would live in the shadow of others. The times in which Richard grew were filled with strife. His father was at odds with the church, most famously with Thomas Becket, the archbishop who would be slain in Canterbury Cathedral. Richard saw the brutal edge of power, and he knew that kings would judge not by mercy but by strength. He also saw the unrest in Aquitaine, where lords often defied their rulers and fought private wars. It was a land that demanded a ruler of steel, one who could crush rebellion but also win loyalty. This was the role Richard was destined to play. Richard's bond with his mother was deep. Eleanor was not like other women of her time. She had been Queen of France before she wed Henry. She had ridden on crusade to the Holy Land. She had faced scandal, exile, and triumph. She filled Richard's mind with the ideals of knighthood and the glory of song. He came to see himself not only as a ruler, but as a knight of romance, one whose deeds might be sung for centuries. This shaped him more than any lesson from his father. He did not wish to be a king who hid in chambers, signing charters and counting coins. He wished to be a warrior who won renown on the battlefield. As Richard grew into adolescence, his skill with arms became clear. He was fearless in training, eager to test his strength. His temper could flare, and he had little patience for those who crossed him. Yet he could also charm. Like Eleanor, he had a gift for commanding loyalty. Men followed him not only because he was their lord, but because they were drawn to his spirit. He gave the impression of a leader born to rule. This was no small thing in a time when power often rested on personal bonds of trust and respect. When he was still young, his parents' marriage began to collapse. Henry's infidelity was notorious, and Eleanor grew bitter. She withdrew to her beloved Aquitaine, taking Richard with her. This split in the royal family shaped his loyalties. Richard's heart was with his mother and her southern lands, not with his father's cold northern rule. This would one day lead him to raise arms against his father. But as a boy, he simply absorbed the lessons of divided loyalties and the hard truth that family ties could be torn apart by power. By the age of 12, Richard had begun to take part in real political matters. He was named Duke of Aquitaine, a title with centuries of prestige. The lords of the duchy, however, were not quick to bow to a boy. They tested him, and in time they would rise in revolt. Richard's first true battles would come against his own vassals, teaching him the harsh art of crushing rebellion. These early trials gave him a taste of war, but also a sense of purpose. He began to see himself as a man set apart from his brothers, chosen by Eleanor to uphold the honour of Aquitaine. The young duke had a mind for both war and display. He relished tournaments where knights tested their skill in mock combat before crowds of nobles. Here Richard showed his strength, and his name began to spread. He also took to poetry, for the culture of the South prized the art of words as well as arms. Some verses said to be his survive, and though they may not be great works, they reveal a man who wished to be known as both knight and poet. This union of steel and song was at the core of his image. He would not be remembered only for power, but for glory. By the late 1160s, Richard was no longer a child. He was a tall young man with a fierce gaze and commanding presence. His father looked to him as a useful tool in the wider game of Plantagenet power, but Richard was not content to serve without reward. His mother urged him to think of Aquitaine as his own, and he listened. The stage was set for the next chapter of his life, one that would see him take up arms against his own father in rebellion. But the boy who had grown in the halls of Aquitaine, who had listened to tales of heroes and learned to wield a sword with deadly skill, was already becoming the man the world would call Lionheart. By the late 1160s, Richard had grown from a boy into a young man. He had the height and strength of a warrior, and his eyes held the sharpness of one born to command. He was Duke of Aquitaine in name, but in truth his father still held the reins. The lords of the duchy were restless, always eager to test the strength of their ruler, and many of them saw in Richard a chance to strike against Henry the king. Rebellion was in the air, and it was not long before Richard was drawn into it. His father was feared across his dominions. Henry was a tireless ruler, always on the move, seeking to keep control of his vast lands. But the bond between father and son was weak. Richard had grown close to his mother, who resented Henry's harsh hand and his endless betrayals. Eleanor of Aquitaine had once been the Queen of France before she wed Henry, and she had never forgotten her pride. Now she was determined that her sons would not be tools of their father's will. She encouraged them to think of their own rights, their own power, and their own kingdoms. The spark came in 1173. Richard's elder brother Henry, known as the Young King, was crowned during their father's life, but his crown brought him no real power. He was restless, humiliated by his lack of authority, and jealous of the control that his father still held over every coin and sword. His anger grew, and he found allies among his brothers. Richard, though still young, was drawn to his side. He had his own grievances. Though named Duke of Aquitaine, he was little more than a pawn. He longed to rule in truth, to prove his strength, to show the proud lords of the south that he was no boy to be mocked. So the brothers rebelled. Henry the young King Richard and Geoffrey of Brittany turned against their father. They sought support from the King of France, Louis VI, who was Eleanor's former husband. Louis had long hated Henry, and he was eager to strike at him through his own sons. War swept across the lands of the Angevin Empire. Castles rose in defiance, knights rode to plunder, and fathers faced sons in a storm of betrayal. Richard, still in his teens, showed himself a warrior of fierce spirit. He gathered men in Aquitaine and rode against his father's forces. The barons of the duchy, ever eager for strife, joined him in arms. Yet the young duke soon learned that rebellion was not glory but hardship. His father moved swiftly, crushing his son's allies and turning the tide of war. The rebellion faltered, and Richard found himself tested as never before. His pride was great, but he could not match the iron will of Henry. Eleanor herself was seized while trying to ride to her sons. She was taken captive by Henry and shut away, kept under guard for years to come. Richard never forgave his father for this act, and his loyalty to Eleanor remained unbroken. Yet in the short term, he had no choice but to yield. By 1174 the rebellion collapsed, the young king humbled, and the brothers forced to beg for peace. Richard was pardoned, but the lesson was seared into his soul. He had challenged his father and lost, but he had also tasted the fire of command. He would not forget it. The end of the rebellion did not mean peace for Richard. In Aquitaine the lords continued to defy him. They saw in him a youth who could be bent or broken, and they rose in revolt time and again. Richard was forced to fight, and it was in these years that his true reputation was forged. He took up arms not against foreign foes, but against his own vassals. He laid siege to their castles, stormed their walls, and showed no mercy to those who dared resist. He became known as a relentless commander, swift in attack and ruthless in victory. One tale tells of his siege of a rebel stronghold, where he ordered the defenders hanged as an example to all who might defy him. Such acts were harsh, but they were effective. Slowly, Richard bent Aquitaine to his will. The troubadours who had once sung of knights and love now sang of a young duke whose sword brought both fear and awe. He was tall, commanding, and fiery. He was learning to rule by steel. At the same time, Richard did not neglect the image of chivalry. He was a man of both sword and song. He wrote verses of his own, simple but proud, and these spread his name beyond Aquitaine. His presence at tournaments drew crowds, and he became a figure of legend even in youth. He was the image of a knight, the hero of romance made flesh. This balance of cruelty and charm made him both feared and admired. Yet his family ties remained fraught. His elder brother, Henry the young king, was still restless. Though he had been reconciled to their father, he grew jealous once more, especially of Richard. The young king was crowned but powerless, while Richard ruled in truth over Aquitaine. Their rivalry grew sharp. In 1183 it burst into open war as the young king joined southern lords in rebellion against Richard himself. Brother now fought brother, and the lands of Aquitaine burned again. The war was bitter. Richard, hardened by years of strife, fought with skill and fury. His brother, less seasoned, could not match him, but fate struck before the struggle could end in clear victory. The young king fell ill during the campaign. Fever racked his body, and soon he lay dying. On his deathbed he repented his sins and begged forgiveness. Richard, though hard, wept for his brother. When the young king died, Richard became the heir to the throne of England. The path before him changed in that moment. He was no longer only Duke of Aquitaine. He was now the man who might inherit the whole Angevin Empire. Henry the father now faced a new challenge. His surviving sons were restless, ambitious, and unwilling to be bound. Geoffrey sought power in Brittany. John was still young, but favoured by his father, and Richard, proud and unyielding, stood as the strongest of them all. The balance between them was fragile, and Henry's attempts to control them often made matters worse. Richard in particular could not be tamed. He had grown into a man who trusted his own strength above all. He had fought rebels, put down uprisings, and shown himself more than capable of command. He had little patience for his father's attempts to keep him in check. In these years Richard's name began to spread beyond his own lands. He was spoken of in France as a warrior of note. His courage in battle, his skill at siege, and his proud bearing all added to the legend. He was also feared, for his wrath was swift and his punishment severe. He did not bend to others. This made him dangerous to friend and foe alike. As the 1170s gave way to the 1180s, Richard was a man transformed from the boy who had first risen in rebellion. He had fought against his father and lost, fought against his vassals and won, fought against his own brother and endured. He had grown into a figure who inspired loyalty in his soldiers and dread in his enemies. Yet the family strife was far from done. His bond with his father remained strained. His mother was still held in captivity, and his brothers continued to scheme. The dynasty that ruled from the cold shores of England to the warm lands of Aquitaine was held together not by love, but by fear and ambition. Richard stood at the heart of it, a man shaped by rebellion, forged in conflict, and destined for greater storms. Richard had survived the storm of rebellion and the death of his elder brother. By 1174 he was no longer a boy, but a hardened young duke. His rule in Aquitaine had begun in fire and blood. The lords of the south had tested him, and he had broken them. Yet they did not stay quiet for long. Aquitaine was a land of stone castles and proud barons who saw themselves as near equals to their duke. They had rebelled against his mother before him, and they would rebel against him as well. Richard knew this, and he did not shrink from it. He welcomed the chance to prove his strength again and again. He spent much of his youth in constant war. Castles rose in defiance, and he dragged great siege engines across the hills to batter them down. Walls cracked under his hammers, and fires rose into the sky. When the gates fell, he showed little mercy. Those who had mocked him paid with their lives, and their lands were laid waste. He learned to move quickly, to strike before his enemies could gather, and to use fear as much as force. His name spread through Aquitaine as a man who could not be resisted. Yet there was more to Richard than cruelty. He could also charm. He knew how to win loyalty when it suited him. He rewarded those who bent the knee with gifts and honours. He kept troubadours in his court, and they sang of him as a knight without peer. He joined tournaments, and his skill with sword and lance drew admiration. He had a presence that could not be ignored. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a warrior, he seemed born to lead men in battle. His pride was fierce, but it was matched by his courage. His father watched all this with a wary eye. Henry Sire was still king, still the master of England and Normandy and Anjou and much of France. But he saw that Richard was becoming a power in his own right. The boy he had once scolded was now a man with an army and a duchy at his back. Richard's bond remained strained. Richard never forgave his father for the long captivity of Eleanor, and Henry never forgave his son for the rebellion. They worked together when they had to, but trust between them was thin. The death of Henry the young king in 1183 made Richard the main heir to the throne. This changed everything. Now, Henry the father looked to Richard not only as Duke of Aquitaine, but as the man who would one day wear the crown. Yet there was trouble. Richard refused to give up his duchy, for he loved Aquitaine and saw it as his own. His father wished to grant it to John, his youngest and favourite son. Richard would not yield, and father and son were once again set on the path to conflict. War broke out among the brothers once more. Geoffrey of Brittany allied with Philip, the new king of France, against Richard. John schemed with Henry, hoping to claim Aquitaine. Richard was forced to fight them all. The fields of France shook with battles between brothers, and Richard stood at the centre. He was now a commander of great skill, hardened by years of war. He met every challenge with fire and steel. In one campaign Richard faced the combined forces of Geoffrey and Philip. The French king was young but clever, and he sought to cut down Richard before he could rise too high. Yet Richard outmatched him. At the siege of a key stronghold, he led his men with daring and broke the lines of his enemies. His courage on the field, where he fought in the thick of battle, won him the name of Lionheart. This was not a title given in court, but one earned in blood. Men who had fought beside him began to speak of him as a lion among men, fierce, untamed, and fearless. The name clung to him, and it would never leave him. The death of Geoffrey in 1186 and the weakness of John left Richard even stronger. He was now the greatest of Henry's sons, and the only one fit to rule. But his bond with his father grew worse. Henry clung to power and refused to step aside. Richard demanded recognition as heir, and he found support in the most unlikely place. He allied himself with Philip of France, the same king who had fought him. The two struck a pact, bound by common cause against Henry. Richard swore homage to Philip and joined him in campaigns against his own father. The war between father and son had reached its final stage. Richard showed once again his skill in war. He drove deep into his father's lands, taking castles and breaking armies. Henry, once the unstoppable ruler of Europe, was now old and weary. His health failed, and his spirit was broken by the betrayal of his sons. In 1189, defeated and ill, Henry died at Chinon. Richard stood victorious. At last he was King of England, Lord of Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. He had fought his father for years and had won, though at the cost of love and loyalty. His mother Eleanor was freed, and Richard gave her honour, for she had been his guide since childhood. The road ahead now lay open for him. Richard had become a ruler feared across Europe. He was no longer only a duke or a prince, but a king in his own right. Yet he was not content with crowns and castles. From youth he had dreamed of glory beyond the narrow struggles of his family. He had listened to the songs of knights who fought for faith, and he longed to take part in the great cause of his age. The call to crusade echoed across Christendom. The Holy Land had fallen into the hands of Saladin, and the Pope called on kings and lords to take up the cross. Richard was eager to answer. He had fought in the hills of Aquitaine and the fields of France, but his heart longed for a greater stage. His reign as king would begin with fire, and his name would be carried not only across Europe, but to the shores of the eastern seas. By the time he wore the crown in Westminster in September 1189, Richard was already a legend. He was known as a warrior without fear, a man of both harsh wrath and chivalric splendor. He was not a ruler who cared for laws or taxes or charters. He cared for battle, for honor, and for fame. His kingdom would not see him often, for his eyes were set on distant lands. But for now, in the years before his crusade, he stood as a lion crowned, the greatest knight of his age, and a king ready to carve his story into the chronicles of the world. The summer of 1189 brought Richard the crown of England. His father lay dead, broken in body and spirit, and the lion's share of the Angevin Empire now passed to his son. Richard was 32, tall, broad, with golden hair and the air of a warrior. He came to Westminster to be crowned in September, and the ceremony was filled with splendor. Bishops sang prayers, nobles knelt, and the crown was set on his head. Yet even as he swore his oath, Richard's thoughts were not fixed on England. His heart lay elsewhere. The call to crusade rang in his ears, and he was determined to answer. The Holy Land had been shaken by disaster. In 1187, the great Muslim leader Saladin had crushed the Christian armies at Hattin, and Jerusalem had fallen. The loss of the Holy City shocked Europe. From Rome to Paris to London, men spoke of the shame and the need for vengeance. Pope Gregory called for a new crusade, and kings were urged to lead their people east. Richard was stirred as few men were. He had grown up listening to tales of heroes who fought for God, and now he had the chance to take his place among them. The crusade would be his destiny. But before he could set out, he had to secure his realm. He was King of England, yet he saw it not as a land to rule, but as a source of wealth and men for war. His first task was to gather money, for the cost of crusade was vast. Ships had to be built, weapons forged, supplies gathered, and soldiers paid. Richard was ruthless in his drive to raise funds. Offices were sold to the highest bidder, lands were pawned, castles mortgaged. He even declared that he would sell the very city of London if he could find a buyer. Nothing was sacred, for all was bent toward his one goal. This greed for money was matched by a fury for order. Richard was determined to leave behind a stable kingdom before he set sail. He released his mother Eleanor from long captivity, and she became his chief ally, traveling the realm in his name and securing loyalty from nobles. He appointed trusted men to guard the land, for he knew that his brother John was restless. John had been favored by their father and might stir trouble. So Richard gave him lands and titles, but watched him closely. For now, John bided his time. The coronation itself was stained by violence. Richard ordered that no Jews were to attend, for he feared unrest. Yet some came with gifts, and they were driven off by the crowd. Rumors spread that Richard had ordered a massacre, and riots broke out in London. Jewish homes were burned, men and women were slain, and blood ran in the streets. Richard, horrified at the scale of the killing, punished some of the rioters, but the stain remained. His reign had begun with slaughter, a sign of the passions that swept his age. Once crowned and once money had been gathered, Richard turned to the great journey. He was not alone, for other kings too had taken the cross. Philip of France, his one-time enemy and now uneasy ally, also prepared to sail. Frederick Barbarossa, the Emperor of Germany, had already marched east with a vast army. Europe stirred as banners were raised and men swore vows. Richard threw himself into the task with zeal. He hired ships from Genoa and Pisa, bargained with merchants, and prepared one of the greatest fleets ever to leave England. The summer of 1190 saw him leave his shores at last. He bade farewell to England, a land he would barely see again. His mother remained behind to watch over his kingdom, while he and his army crossed the Channel to France. There he met Philip, and the two kings swore to march together. But trust was thin. They were allies for now, but rivals in ambition. Both were young, proud, and eager for glory. They agreed to sail south, gathering strength in Sicily before striking for the Holy Land. Richard's fleet was mighty. It carried knights in shining mail, archers with longbows, engineers with siege engines, and priests with holy relics. The ships themselves were laden with weapons and gold. The voyage began with hope, but storms soon scattered the fleet. Some ships were lost, some driven to strange shores, and many men drowned. Yet most of the army reached Sicily in the autumn. There Richard set about showing his strength. The island was ruled by Tancred, a local lord who had seized power after the death of the king. Richard demanded the rights of his sister, Joan, who had been the widow of the late king. Tancred hesitated, and Richard's patience was short. He attacked, stormed the city of Messina, and seized it by force. The Sicilians were stunned by the speed and fury of his assault. Philip, uneasy at his allies' aggression, looked on with caution. Richard forced Tancred to make peace, gaining money, supplies, and respect. It was a bold start, and it showed Europe that he was no mere pilgrim, but a warrior king. The winter of 1190 was spent in Sicily, and it was here that Richard made a fateful choice. He had long been betrothed to Alice, the sister of Philip, but he had grown cold to the match. He cast her aside, angering his ally, and instead sent for Berengaria of Navarre, a princess from the Pyrenean kingdom. She was brought to him in the spring of 1191, escorted by his mother Eleanor, who at nearly 70 years of age still rode across Europe for her son. Richard and Berengaria were wed in Cyprus that May, their union a bond of politics and affection. Though Richard would never be a devoted husband, the journey to the Holy Land was marked by more strife. A storm drove part of Richard's fleet to Cyprus, where the ruler Isaac Comnenus mistreated his men. Richard responded with his usual fire. He invaded the island, crushed Isaac's forces, and took control. The conquest was swift, and Cyprus became a vital base for the Crusaders. Isaac was captured and bound in silver chains, for Richard had sworn not to put him in iron as a mark of honor. This victory brought both wealth and prestige, and it gave Richard a foothold in the eastern seas. At last, in June 1191, Richard reached Acre. The city had been under siege for nearly 2 years, with crusaders from across Europe camped outside its walls. Disease, hunger, and despair had worn them down, but the arrival of Richard changed everything. He came with ships, soldiers, and spirit. His presence lifted the camp, and his command brought new life to the siege. The next chapter of his story, the Holy War itself, was about to begin. But already, by the time his sails touched the Levantine coast, Richard had shown himself as more than a king. He was a conqueror, a leader, and the embodiment of knightly glory. His crown was not of gold alone, but of steel and fire. The summer sun beat down on the walls of Acre. The city had stood under siege for nearly 2 years, held by the forces of Saladin, while the Crusaders struggled outside. Disease and hunger had thinned their ranks. Men had died by the thousands, and hope had almost faded. But when Richard arrived in June 1191, the camp stirred with new life. His fleet filled the harbour, his banners flew high, and his soldiers marched with order. The Crusaders saw in him the leader they had long waited for. His presence alone was enough to turn despair into fire. Richard wasted no time. Though stricken with fever on arrival, he still commanded from his tent. He ordered his engines built, towers raised, and assaults prepared. He studied the walls, searched for weak points, and directed every blow. His energy was fierce, and men obeyed without question. Philip of France was also there, and though the two kings worked together, Richard soon outshone him. His will was stronger, his command more sure, and his courage more visible. Even while sick, he showed himself at the front, an example to all. The siege raged through the summer heat. Stones hurled by engines crashed into the walls, and arrows flew day and night. The defenders fought with equal fury, pouring fire and pitch on the attackers, and holding every breach. But the Crusaders pressed harder. Richard himself was seen firing a great crossbow, his bolts striking down men on the walls. His knights stormed the ditches, and his miners dug beneath the towers. Slowly, under his drive, the city began to falter. In July, at last, Acre surrendered. The banners of the cross were raised over its towers, and the Crusaders poured into the city. It was a moment of triumph, the first great victory of the new crusade. Yet it came with strife. Richard and Philip quarrelled over the spoils, over the rule of the city, and over the honour of command. Philip, weary and jealous of Richard's fame, soon left for France. His departure left Richard as the clear leader of the crusade, though it also meant he bore the full weight of its burden. The victory at Acre also brought a darker deed. Thousands of Muslim prisoners, held as hostages, became a thorn in Richard's side. Talks with Saladin over their release dragged on, and tempers frayed. At last, Richard gave the order. The prisoners, men, women, and children, were led out and slain before the walls. It was a ruthless act meant to show Saladin that Richard would not be stalled. The Crusaders were shocked, the Muslims enraged, and the world took note. Richard was a man of both glory and cruelty, and this act revealed the lion's claws as much as his heart. With Acre secured, the march to Jerusalem began. Richard led his army south along the coast, his fleet shadowing the march by sea. Saladin harried them at every turn, sending horsemen to strike at their lines, but Richard kept order. He rode with his men, fought in the skirmishes, and made sure the march never broke. The discipline he imposed was key, for without it the army would have scattered. The great test came at Arsuf in September 1191. Saladin gathered his full force and struck at the Crusaders as they marched. The Muslim horsemen swept against their lines, raining arrows, hoping to break them apart. Richard kept his knights in check, holding them steady against the storm. The sun blazed, the arrows fell, and men cried out for release. At last, when the time was right, Richard gave the signal. His knights lowered their lances and charged. The clash was fierce, the ground shook, and the enemy lines broke. Saladin's army fell back, beaten. It was a great victory, and Richard's name was sung through the camp as the saviour of the crusade. From Arsuf the march pressed on. The coast was secured, towns taken, and supply lines strengthened. Richard's command kept the army strong, but Jerusalem still lay ahead. The holy city was the prize, yet it stood deep within Saladin's lands, guarded by strong walls and fierce defenders. Twice the Crusaders drew near to it, in the winter of 1191 and the spring of 1192. Each time hope rose, and each time it failed. Richard studied the ground, weighed the risks, and chose caution. To strike at Jerusalem without secure supply would mean disaster. He would not throw his men into ruin. This choice was bitter. Many in the army longed to see the city, to kneel at the Holy Sepulchre, and to claim it for Christendom. They grew restless, some even angry, blaming Richard for holding them back. But he knew the truth. To take Jerusalem and then lose it again would be worse than not taking it at all. He bore their anger, for he believed his judgment was sound. Yet in their hearts, the men yearned for the holy city, and his caution cost him their love. Still, Richard did not cease in war. He struck inland, raided deep, and won victories in the field. His courage never faltered. He was seen riding at the front, his sword flashing, his voice carrying over the din. Saladin himself admired him, calling him a man of great valour. There was respect between the two, though they never met face to face. Both knew that they were matched, each too strong for the other to destroy. The war dragged on, and the strain grew heavy. Richard faced quarrels among his own allies, for the princes of the crusade often pulled in different ways. He also faced news from home. His brother John was plotting, his throne was not secure, and Philip of France whispered against him in Europe. Richard could not remain forever in the east. His duty to his crown weighed on him, even as his vow to the cross pulled at his soul. In the summer of 1192, Richard struck one last blow. He marched once more along the coast, and at Jaffa he faced Saladin again. The city had fallen to the Muslims, but Richard arrived with speed, stormed the gates, and drove them out. When Saladin returned with his host, Richard fought with fire. He led the defense with his own hands, charging at the head of his knights, scattering foes in the sand. His courage at Jaffa was the stuff of legend. Stories told of him cutting through ranks of enemies, his sword rising and falling, his voice crying out to his men. The city was saved, and Saladin was forced to retreat. But still Jerusalem remained beyond reach. Both sides were wary, both knew that the war could drag on without end. In September 1192, peace was made. Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce. The coast would remain in Christian hands, and pilgrims would be allowed to enter Jerusalem without fear. It was not the victory Richard had dreamed of, but it was a settlement that saved lives and held honor. The crusade was over. Richard had not taken Jerusalem, but his name was now famed across the world. The Muslims respected him, the Christians admired him, and even his enemies called him a lion. He had shown himself a commander without fear, a warrior without equal, and a king who placed honor above safety. Yet he had also shown his flaws. His wrath, his pride, and his cruelty left deep marks. The crusade had revealed the fullness of his nature, both light and dark. Now his thoughts turned home. He had been gone for years, and the news from England was grim. His brother schemed, his crown was at risk, and Philip of France moved against his lands. Richard had to return. The lion had roared in the east, but now he must cross seas again to guard his throne. The journey would be long, and fate would not grant him an easy path. His trials were far from done, and his greatest peril still lay ahead. The year 1192 found Richard weary yet unbroken. He had fought for months in the heat of the Holy Land, striking at Saladin again and again, winning victories that saved the crusade but not the Holy City. Jerusalem remained beyond his grasp, its walls untaken, its gates still in the hands of the Muslims. Richard had marched close to it more than once, and the men of the cross had begged him to press on, but each time he turned back. He knew what others did not wish to see. To hold Jerusalem without supply, without reinforcements, was to invite ruin. He would not throw his men to death for glory alone. Still, this choice weighed on him. His heart longed for the city, and his pride burned at the thought that he had come so far yet not achieved the final goal. Saladin watched him with respect. The two men never stood face to face, but they knew each other through battle and through rumor. Richard had earned the name of lion among the Muslims, a warrior whose courage was unmatched, whose sword never rested. Saladin was no less admired by his own men. He was calm, generous, and steadfast. He too had seen many battles, and he knew the cost of war. Between the two there was both rivalry and regard. They fought with fire, yet they did not hate each other. After Jaffa, when Richard had struck with sudden force and driven Saladin back, the war reached a pause. Both sides were tired, both had suffered loss, and both saw that endless struggle would bring nothing but more graves. Yet neither could yield too much. Richard needed honor, for he had crossed seas to win it, and Saladin needed to hold Jerusalem, for it was the heart of his cause. So they began to speak of peace. The talks were slow, carried by messengers who moved between the camps. Demands rose and fell. Richard asked for Jerusalem, but Saladin refused. Saladin asked for the Crusaders to leave the coast, but Richard would not. Each side tested the other, each sought a bargain that would not shame them. In the end, the weight of war forced compromise. A truce was made. The coast from Tyre to Jaffa would remain in Christian hands, a line of strong ports to guard the pilgrims. The hinterland would stay under Saladin's rule, but pilgrims of all faiths would be free to travel to Jerusalem. The city itself would remain in Muslim hands, yet its doors would not be closed to those who came in peace. This peace was signed in September 1192. It was not the triumph Richard had once hoped for, yet it was no defeat. The Crusaders kept a foothold in the land, and the holy places were open once more. For Saladin, it was a settlement that saved Jerusalem without endless bloodshed. Both men could return to their people with honor, though neither with all he desired. Richard spent the last weeks of his time in the east strengthening the ports, repairing fortresses, and making sure the truce would hold. He knew he could not stay. His kingdom called him back. Letters from England told of unrest, of John's schemes, of Philip's moves against his lands in France. He had been gone for years, and his throne was at risk. His heart was torn, for he wished to remain and fight for Jerusalem. Yet duty pulled him west. As he prepared to leave, his thoughts often turned to Saladin. They had tested each other in war, and though neither had prevailed fully, they had come to respect one another deeply. Tales spread of courtesies between them, of gifts exchanged, of words of praise sent across the lines. Whether all were true mattered little, for the image was strong. The world saw in them not only enemies but rivals bound by honour. Richard was the lion of the west, Saladin the star of the east. Their struggle became legend, a tale of knight against knight, of faith against faith, of two great men whose names would echo through the ages. Yet beneath this legend lay truth. Richard was a man of fierce pride, whose wrath could be cruel, who had slain prisoners without pity. Saladin was a man of calm, who spared foes and showed mercy, yet who never wavered in his hold on the holy city. They were not saints, but men of their age, shaped by faith, by war, and by power. Still, their rivalry carried a strange nobility that men admired then, and still admire now. Richard's departure was heavy with regret. He had not seen Jerusalem. He had stood on its hills, gazed toward its towers, but never entered its gates. His men longed for the holy city, and many grumbled that the crusade had failed. Yet Richard bore it with pride. He had done what he could. He had saved the coast, struck victories, and secured pilgrim rights. He had shown the world that he was a king of courage, a knight of unmatched strength. His conscience told him he had not wasted lives for a dream that could not be held. The march to the coast was solemn. The Crusaders looked back on the land they had fought for, knowing they might never return. Richard promised them that one day he would come again, that the fight was not over, that Jerusalem would yet be theirs. Many believed him, for his will was strong and his voice carried fire. But fate would not allow it. This was his last time in the East. He set sail in October 1192. His fleet was scattered by storms, and the journey became perilous. Richard, restless and impatient, sought to travel in disguise through Europe, but danger followed him. His enemies lay in wait, and before long he would be seized and held for ransom. But that was still to come. For now he left behind the memory of his struggle with Saladin, a chapter of his life that defined him more than any other. The crusade did not end in triumph, yet it made Richard a legend. He had faced the might of the East and not been broken. He had fought Saladin to a standstill, and though Jerusalem was lost, his courage was not. In song and story, his name was carried far. Troubadours in Aquitaine sang of his battles. Chroniclers in England wrote of his deeds. Even in the lands of Islam, his name was spoken with respect. He had become more than a king. He had become the Lionheart, a symbol of courage and of the fierce spirit of the age. Richard left the Holy Land in the autumn of 1192. He had fought for years against Saladin and had made peace, though without taking Jerusalem. His thoughts turned home, for his throne was at risk. Philip of France was already striking at his lands, and John, his own brother, was plotting against him. Richard knew he must return with speed. Yet fate did not grant him a clear path. His fleet was scattered by storms, and he was driven into strange waters. Some ships reached safe ports, but others were lost. Richard himself set out with only a few companions, hoping to slip across Europe in secret. He travelled in disguise, dressed as a humble pilgrim, his crown set aside. He made his way north, through lands that were not friendly. But his face was known, and he could not hide forever. Near Vienna, in December 1192, he was recognized. He had sought to pass through the lands of Duke Leopold of Austria, but Leopold had reason to hate him. Richard had torn down his banner at Acre, and insulted his honor before all the Crusaders. The Duke's men seized him, and Richard the Lionheart was a prisoner. The news spread like fire. A king of England, a leader of the crusade, taken and held in chains. It shocked Europe. Many whispered that it was shameful to hold a crusader captive, but Leopold cared little for honor. He saw in Richard a prize beyond measure. Soon he passed his captive into the hands of Emperor Henry VI of Germany. The emperor was a man of greed and ambition, and Richard was the greatest prize of all. He could demand a ransom that would drain kingdoms, and so he did. Richard was carried across Europe, from castle to castle, kept under guard. Yet he did not despair. He bore his captivity with pride, as if it were another trial sent to test him. He wrote songs while in prison, verses of longing and defiance. His words spoke of betrayal, of the pain of absence, and of the hope of return. Troubadours carried them across the lands, and they reached even England. His people heard the voice of their king, not silenced by chains, but burning still with spirit. The ransom demanded was vast, greater than any before. 150,000 marks of silver, a sum so heavy it seemed beyond reach. In England, the news caused fear and awe. But Eleanor, the king's mother, took command. Though aged, she was tireless. She called councils, raised taxes, and stripped the churches of treasure. Gold and silver were melted down, and every family gave what they could. It was said that 2 out of every 3 years, income of the realm went to free the king. The people gave, for they saw Richard as their champion, their warrior king. Though he had spent little time in England, his fame had bound their hearts to him. John, his brother, sought to use this moment to claim the throne. He spread lies, saying Richard was dead, and tried to win the crown. But his efforts faltered. Many nobles still feared and loved the Lionheart. They would not follow John while Richard lived. Philip of France also struck, taking castles in Normandy, hoping to profit from his rival's fall. The kingdom stood in peril, yet the ransom grew bit by bit. Eleanor would not rest until her son was free. In the cold halls of his prison, Richard kept his pride. The emperor at times treated him with respect, for even in chains the Lionheart carried himself like a king. He argued with his captors, swore his innocence of the charges placed against him, and demanded release. He was accused of betraying the crusade, of treachery against allies, even of plotting against the emperor himself. These charges were heavy, but they were no more than excuses for gain. Everyone knew that silver, not justice, was the true reason for his chains. By the start of 1194, the ransom was nearly gathered. Wagons of silver crossed Europe, guarded by knights, bound for the emperor's coffers. At last the sum was enough, and Richard was set free. He had spent more than a year in captivity, his crown in peril, his lands under attack, but his spirit unbroken. When he stepped into the air as a free man, the world stirred again. The Lionheart had returned. His journey home was swift, for he wasted no time. He met his mother with deep gratitude, for without her he would still be bound. He sent word to his brother John, warning him that treachery would not be forgiven. John hurried to beg pardon, throwing himself at Richard's mercy. The Lionheart, though wrathful, spared him. Perhaps he saw use in keeping his brother close. Perhaps he wished to show that his strength was so great he could forgive. But his trust was thin, and John knew it. Richard's first thought was war. Philip of France had taken his lands while he was bound, and Richard swore to take them back. He rode into Normandy, gathered his knights, and prepared for battle once more. His captivity had not broken him. If anything, it had sharpened his will. He would show the world that no chains could bind him for long, and no enemy could profit from his absence. The story of his captivity spread across Europe, carried in song and tale. It added to his legend. He was no longer only the Crusader king, but the king who had been sold and ransomed, who had borne chains yet kept his pride. His people saw him as chosen, protected by God, spared for some higher purpose. His foes saw him as a danger renewed, a lion loosed once more. For Richard, the year in prison was not wasted. It gave him time to reflect, to shape his resolve, and to burn brighter with rage at his foes. He had been humbled in body, but not in spirit. Now, free, he turned all his strength to the wars ahead. The crusade was behind him, Jerusalem still untaken, but new battles waited in France. The Lionheart was not done. His roar would echo again, this time against the walls and fields of his rivals in the west. Richard stepped back into his realm in 1194 with the fire of vengeance in his heart. A year in chains had not dimmed his will. He had been humbled in body, but not in spirit. He returned to find his lands threatened, his brother shamed, and his enemies bold. The crown of England still rested on his head, but to hold it firm he would need war. His gaze turned first to France. Philip of France had struck while he was captive, seizing castles and towns in Normandy. Philip had mocked him in letters, saying the lion was caged and the fox free to hunt. Richard swore that such insults would be repaid with steel. England welcomed him with joy. Crowds filled the streets, church bells rang, and his people gave thanks for his return. Yet he did not linger. He was not a king who loved the quiet halls of Westminster. He was a warrior, and he longed for the field. He crossed the Channel within weeks and rode into Normandy. Philip had grown bold. But when word spread that Richard was free, fear stirred. The Lionheart was not a man to forgive. Richard began at once to recover what had been lost. He moved with speed, striking at castles, storming walls, and reclaiming towns. His skill in siege was unmatched. Engines hurled stones, towers pressed close, and his men battered the gates. Philip was forced back again and again. Richard's presence inspired his soldiers. He fought among them, sword in hand, his voice carrying over the clash. He was not a king who hid behind lines. He was seen in the thick of danger, his golden hair shining in the sun, his armor bright with dust and blood. Men followed him with faith, for he led as one of them. John, his brother, sought to make peace with him. He had betrayed him during captivity, hoping to take the throne, but now he bent the knee. Richard forgave him, though trust was thin. Perhaps he saw John as weak, not worth his wrath. Perhaps he wished to keep the peace at home while he fought abroad. Eleanor urged mercy, and Richard listened. Yet he never forgot John's treachery, and he kept watch on him. War with Philip raged for years. From 1194 until his death, Richard's life was consumed by battle. He rebuilt alliances, drew knights from across his lands, and poured treasure into war. His ransom had drained England, yet he found means to raise new funds. He taxed, he borrowed, he sold offices. All was bent toward the struggle with France. He saw Philip not only as a rival king, but as a foe who had mocked him in weakness. Pride drove him as much as duty. The campaigns were fierce. Richard proved again and again that he was a master of war. He built and rebuilt castles, strongholds that could guard his lands. His greatest work was Che Tu Gaylord, a vast fortress on the Seine, which he called his beloved daughter. Its walls rose strong and high, its towers faced the river, and it stood as a symbol of his strength. It was said no castle could match it, and Richard poured his soul into its design. For him, castles were not only defences but weapons, the means to strike and hold. Philip tried to outwit him with trickery and sudden strikes, but Richard was always swift in reply. He learned to match wits as well as swords. He set ambushes, cut off supplies, and broke sieges with daring charges. More than once he was seen leading a small force against a larger one, his courage giving him the edge. His foes grew cautious, for they knew that the lion could strike at any moment. Yet Richard's rule was not gentle. His hunger for war drained his lands. Men groaned under heavy taxes, silver was taken from churches, and labour was demanded for castles and roads. England saw little of him, for he spent almost all his time in France. To his people at home, he was a distant figure, more a legend than a king. But in Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, he was a constant presence, feared and respected. Despite the endless strife, Richard never lost the spirit of chivalry. He kept troubadours in his court, listened to songs, and wrote verses of his own. He was harsh in battle, but generous in peace. He rewarded knights who served him well, gave gifts to followers, and treated his enemies with honour when it suited him. Yet he never forgot a slight, and he never forgave mockery. He fought not only for land, but for pride. By 1198 the war was at its height. Richard had beaten Philip in several battles, and forced him to yield ground. His name once again shone across Europe. He was called the greatest knight of his age, the lion among men. Chroniclers wrote of his courage, poets sang of his might, and his foes admitted his power. Yet pride can lead even lions to danger. Richard, restless and daring, could not turn from strife. In early 1199 he rode to Limousin, where a minor lord had risen against him. It was a small revolt, hardly worthy of a king's hand, but Richard would not ignore it. He marched to put it down, to show that none could defy him, no matter how small. At the castle of Cheech he set his siege. Engines battered the walls, and his men closed in. Richard rode close to direct the assault, fearless as always. As he passed the walls, a defender fired a crossbow. The bolt struck Richard in the shoulder. At first the wound seemed slight. He laughed, pulled the shaft, and went on. But the wound grew foul. Infection set in, and fever gripped him. He weakened, though he tried to hide it. His men saw him pale, his strength fading, yet his pride held firm. He faced death as he had faced life, with courage and fire. For days he lingered, the fever burning, the wound blackening. He named his brother John as heir, though he had little faith in him. He made peace with God, confessed his sins, and spoke with his mother, who had come to his side. At last, on the 6th of April 1199, Richard the Lionheart died. He was 41 years old. His body was laid to rest at Fontevraud, beside his father Henry. His heart was buried at Rouen, in the land he had fought to guard. His name lived on in song and story. To his people he was the warrior king, the knight who had spent his life in battle. To his foes he was the lion, fierce and proud. To his mother he was the son who had fulfilled her dream, to rule Aquitaine with fire and courage. His reign had been short, his time in England brief, but his legend was vast. Richard was not a gentle ruler. He drained his lands of wealth, cared little for laws, and gave little peace. Yet his courage was unmatched, his will unbroken, his pride fierce. He was the mirror of his age, a knight, king whose life was spent in war. Even in death, his name was carried with awe. Troubadours sang of him, chroniclers wrote of him, and the people of Europe spoke of the Lionheart. His roar had shaken the world, and though his body lay still, his legend did not. The spring of 1199 brought Richard to the hills of Limarsen. He had fought for years against Philip of France, and had driven him back time after time. Yet even as he stood strong, small fires of revolt burned within his lands. One such fire was at Chelas, where a minor lord refused his rule. The matter was small, but Richard was not a king to overlook insult. Pride drove him, as it always had. He could not let a defiance stand, no matter how slight. His will was to crush rebellion before it spread, to show his power in every corner of his realm. So he marched to Chelas with his knights and engines of war. The castle stood on a low rise, with walls of stone and defenders ready. Richard set his camp nearby, and his men prepared the siege. Towers were built, engines rolled forward, and stones were hurled against the walls. Richard himself rode close, eager to see every detail. He was a king who trusted his own eyes, who did not wait for reports from others. He directed the work with fire, shouting commands, pointing his sword, urging his men on. On the 26th of March he rode near the walls, where defenders stood ready with bows and crossbows. One of them, a man with little armour, aimed from the battlements. His bolt flew and struck Richard in the shoulder. The king flinched, but did not fall. At first he laughed at the wound, pulling the shaft and casting it aside. He returned to his tent as if it were nothing. But soon the wound grew worse. The flesh turned dark, the fever rose, and Richard's strength began to fade. He called for surgeons, and they tried to cut out the rot, but their skill could not save him. The wound festered, the pain spread, and Richard knew he was dying. His pride was fierce, yet he faced death as he had faced life with courage. He spoke calmly, though his body burned with fever. He named his brother John as heir, for though he did not trust him, there was no other choice. He gave gifts to his men, and he asked for mercy for the crossbowman who had struck him. The man was brought before him, a simple soldier, poor and fearful. Richard looked on him with pity, and said he should be spared. But when Richard died, the man was flayed and hanged by mercenaries, his mercy ignored. Eleanor came to her son's side. She was old now, near 80, but still strong of spirit. She had guided him from birth, made him Duke of Aquitaine, and seen him crowned. Now she watched as he slipped away. Richard spoke with her, confessed his sins, and made peace with God. He had been a warrior all his life, and now he was at his end. On the 6th of April 1199 he died, in his tent outside Chelas, with his mother near him and his men in grief. He was 41 years old. The news spread fast. A king of England, a crusader, the Lionheart, fallen not in great battle, but by the bolt of a nameless man at a minor siege. Many saw it as bitter irony that one who had faced Saladin, fought Philip, stormed castles, and defied chains should fall to a peasant's hand. Yet it was true to life, for war cares little for glory, and death often comes in small moments. Still, the shock was deep. His men mourned, his foes whispered, and his people wondered what would follow. His body was laid to rest with care. His entrails were buried at Church-Lus, his heart at Rouen, in the land of Normandy he had loved, and his body at Fontevraud beside his father Henry. 3 parts of him for 3 places, each tied to his life and his rule. Priests sang, knights wept, and Eleanor stood as the last great figure of her house. With Richard gone, the empire he had held with steel and fire would never be the same. John took the crown, but he was no Lionheart. He was cunning, but he lacked the courage, the pride, and the presence of his brother. Philip of France saw his chance, and he struck with fresh power. The lands Richard had fought to hold began to slip away. Within years much of the empire was lost, and the dream of Angevin power was broken. Many looked back and said that had Richard lived longer, the lion might have kept the fox at bay. But fate had cut him down, and history turned. Richard's reign had been short, only 10 years as king, much of it spent abroad. He had drained England of wealth, sold offices, taxed heavily, and cared little for law. He had spent fewer than 6 months in the land he ruled. Yet he was loved by his people. They saw in him the image of a true king, a knight of glory, a man who carried their honor to distant lands. They forgave his absence, for his name gave them pride. He was not a builder of peace, but a maker of legend. His enemies, too, respected him. Saladin had spoken of him with honor. Philip had feared him even as he fought him, and the emperor had valued him above gold. His name spread across Europe and beyond. In song and story he was the Lionheart, the king who lived by the sword, who never bent, who died as he had lived, proud and unyielding. The death of Richard marked the end of an age. The 12th century had been the time of crusade, of knights, of song and war. Richard embodied it all. He was fierce, bold, cruel at times, yet always true to his nature. He sought glory above all else, and he found it. He did not rule with wisdom, but with fire. He did not bring peace, but he brought fame. His name endured, carved in chronicles, sung in halls, and remembered in every tale of knights and kings. At Church-Lus, the castle where he fell, stories grew of his last days. Some said he forgave his killer with a smile, some that he cursed him, some that he spoke only of his mother. The truth mattered little, for the legend was greater. The image of the Lionheart dying by a single bolt became part of his story, a reminder that even the greatest are mortal, that courage does not shield against fate. Eleanor lived on, her heart broken yet her pride unshaken. She buried her son, guided her grandson, and saw her house fall into strife. She had shaped the lion, and she had seen him rise and fall. Her own legend grew with his, for together they had marked their age. Richard the Lionheart was gone, but his roar still echoed. In every tale of knights, in every song of crusade, in every story of kings who rode with sword in hand, his spirit lived. He had been born in Oxford, raised in Aquitaine, crowned in Westminster, chained in Germany, freed by ransom, and slain in Limousin. His life had been a path of war from first to last. His death was the end of a man, but the birth of a myth. The death of Richard the Lionheart in 1199 sent ripples through Europe. A king had fallen, not in the heat of a great battle, but by a simple crossbow bolt at a small siege. Yet his passing did not diminish his legend. If anything, it gave it more power. The lion was struck down by fate, not by a rival king, and in that moment he became more than a man. He became myth. His enemies feared him, his people loved him, and his name was carried far beyond his reign. His life had been short as kingship goes, but his story was eternal. In England, sorrow filled the land. Though Richard had spent little time there, the people saw him as their champion. They forgave his absence, for he was their pride abroad. He had fought Saladin, he had faced the emperor, he had stood against Philip, and he had never bent. His people saw in him the spirit of the age, the knight who embodied courage. They wept for him, even though his heavy taxes had drained them. They mourned, even though he had sold offices and seized treasure. for the Lionheart was theirs, and his fame gave them honour. In France there was relief and fear. Philip of France rejoiced, for his greatest rival was gone. He had fought Richard for years and had never broken him. Now the path lay open to strike at John, a weaker man, easier prey. Yet there was fear too, for the shadow of Richard remained. His castle still stood, his men still fought, and his mother still ruled with iron will. The memory of his strength lingered, and it shaped how men acted for years to come. In the Holy Land, his name was spoken with respect. The Muslims had fought him, had felt his sword, had seen his courage. Saladin had died before him, yet those who had stood with him remembered. They called him a man of fire, a warrior of truth, one who fought with skill and honour. His acts were feared, his cruelty remembered, yet his courage was admired. Even those who were his foes told tales of his might. His legacy grew through song. Troubadours sang of him in Aquitaine, of the king who was also a poet, who wrote of longing from his prison cell. Minstrels carried his story across Europe, of battles won, of crusades fought, of chains endured. He was remembered not as a ruler of laws or a keeper of peace, but as a knight among kings. His verses gave him a softer image, showing that even the lion could sing of sorrow and love. It was this blend of steel and song that made him stand apart. Chroniclers too built his legend. They wrote of his battles in detail, of the storm at Arsuf, of the siege at Acre, of the clash at Jaffa. They told of his duel with Saladin, not face to face, but in the clash of armies and the weight of wills. They called him the perfect knight, the model of chivalry, though they also noted his flaws. They wrote of his pride, his wrath, his cruelty to prisoners, his greed for money. Yet even with these faults, his image was grand. He was a man of his age, fierce and flawed, yet greater than most. His mother Eleanor ensured his memory endured. She outlived him, guiding John and watching her house falter. She spoke of Richard as her true heir, the son who had fulfilled her dreams. She saw in him the spirit of Aquitaine, the pride of her blood, and she shaped how others remembered him. She placed him in tombs of honour, kept his songs alive, and guarded his name. Through her, the Lionheart lived on. Richard's reign left marks on the land. Chateau Gaillard stood as his monument, a castle built with his vision, his pride, his love of war. Its walls rose high over the Seine, a symbol of his strength. Though it would one day fall, for a time it was thought unbreakable. His sieges, his fortresses, his roads of war, all left traces of his will. He had carved his rule into stone as much as into story. Yet his rule also left scars. England had been drained of silver, churches stripped of treasure, people pressed for ransom and tax. The weight of his wars fell heavy, and his brother John inherited a kingdom weary and poor. The loss of lands in France followed, and much of the Angevin dream was broken. Some said Richard's pride had cost too much, that his endless wars had weakened his house. But others said that he alone had held the empire together, that once he was gone it could not last. In later years, his name grew brighter still. Writers called him the Knight Without Fear, the Crusader King, the Lion of the West. Stories told of him dueling Saladin, of him cleaving through ranks of foes, of him forgiving his killer with a smile. Legends made him more than he was, yet they also held truth. He had been fearless, he had been fierce, and he had been proud. He had lived for honour, not for peace. His heart, buried at Rouen, became a relic of devotion. His body at Fontevraud lay beside his father, two kings bound in death as they had been in life. Pilgrims visited his tomb, gazed on his effigy, and prayed for his soul. His image in stone showed a calm king, yet those who knew his story saw the fire beneath. His name was carved on lips as much as on walls. Richard's legacy was not only in war, but in the idea of kingship. He showed what it meant to be a warrior king, one who led from the front, who shared danger, who inspired men with his own courage. He was not a ruler of courts or charters, not a maker of peace or builder of law. He was a king of the sword, a knight who wore the crown as armour. Many would measure themselves against him, but few could match him. He was also remembered in England as a distant king, a man who cared little for his land, yet gave it pride through his name. He was more French than English, more Aquitanian than Norman, yet his legend became part of English history. He gave the realm an image of might, even if his hand rarely touched it. In time, when people thought of the medieval king, they thought of Richard. His enemies called him reckless. His friends called him bold. His people called him the Lionheart. Each name held truth. He was reckless, for he spent lives and wealth with little care. He was bold, for he faced odds and dangers without fear. He was the Lionheart, for his courage was unmatched, his pride unyielding, his presence unforgettable. Centuries later, his name was still sung. Tales of Robin Hood placed him as the true king, absent in crusade while John ruled unjustly. Stories of knights spoke of him as their model. Poets painted him as the perfect crusader, the king who fought for God and honor. His name stood with Arthur and Charlemagne, part of the great tale of kings and heroes. Yet beneath the legend, the man remained. A ruler who drained his lands, who cared little for peace, who lived for war. A son who loved his mother, who never forgave his father, who mistrusted his brothers. A knight who could sing of sorrow, yet order the death of captives. A king who gave England pride but little care. A man of flesh and blood, fierce, flawed, and unforgettable. Richard the Lionheart's legacy is the story of his age. The 12th century was an age of crusade, of knights, of castles, of faith and war. He embodied it all. His life was fire, his death was fate, his name was legend. He was not the wisest of kings, nor the gentlest, nor the most just. But he was the most remembered, the most sung, the most feared. His roar still echoes, not in battle, but in memory.